I want you to now imagine a classroom. 4 walls, rows of desks, probably a textbook, a whiteboard, an exam at the end of the year. For many, that is education, a blueprint, a carefully designed system that tells students to sit here, learn this, memorize that, pass the tests, and if you do well enough, maybe, just maybe, you will succeed. Well, in June 2022, I walked into a school that made me think if that blueprint was ever enough. And that school was SKRPS Bandung, an all-orang asli school located in the interiors of Gerit, Perak. Some students cross rivers to get there. Some walk to jungle path. Some arrive hungry. And some arrive carrying burdens no child should carry. But yet, they still came. Not because education was easy, but somewhere deep within them, there was still hope. So you see, I was part of Teach for Malaysia's inaugural fellowship. 27 of us started entering communities we knew very little about. We went through 5 weeks of preparations. We learned pedagogy, we learned classroom management, we learned assessment, we learned everything that a good teacher should know. And on my first day, when I thought I was ready, I had my slides prepared, my assessments, my worksheets, everything the blueprint said I needed. But when I arrived, this was my blueprint. A paper plane. The problem was not that my students was not learning. The problem was, I was trying to teach them even before trying to understand them. So as part of a pioneering co-teaching model, I was paired with a senior teacher called Cikgu Jo. So Cikgu Johari was the Senior Assistant of Student Affairs with 24 years of experience. At that time, I had none. And naturally, I felt very intimidated. Some months later, he would admit something that still makes me smile till today. When he first heard that a new teacher would be teaching alongside him in the classroom, he wasn't excited. Instead, he thought that I would be an added burden. But that perspective would soon change during one history lesson when we taught about Kemerdekaan, or Malaysia's independence. So Cikgu Jo wrote the word Kemerdekaan in capital letters across the whiteboard, and he asked students to read after from the textbooks. As I was standing at the back of the class, I noticed a boy at the corner, sitting down, holding his book held upside down. He wasn't reading because he couldn't. And so I walked towards him and knelt next to him. He gently lowered his head and fell silent. I walked up to Cikgu Jo and told him what had happened. He was stunned. Not because the boy couldn't read, but because we almost missed it. And that was the start of one of the most meaningful partnerships of my life. And together, me and Cikgu Johari arrived at a difficult truth, that you cannot teach students whose realities you refuse to understand. You see, at Orang Asli schools, what makes it even harder for us to teach are the assumptions surrounding our children. Before I arrived, we've heard comments saying that you don't have to teach them, you don't have to put in much effort, you teach them today, they'll forget tomorrow. And one of the most heartbreaking comments came from someone speaking directly to a child. Orang asli mana boleh pergi jauh? You stay in the village anyways. The problem with prejudice is not that it merely exists. The problem is that when people begin telling it as a story, it runs deep. And we realized at that moment that illiteracy was just part of the issue. The bigger challenge was relevance. So imagine going to a classroom, teaching science from the textbooks, when only 2 out of 19 students who can barely read. During one lesson, my students became fascinated by the stories of my undergraduate years in Sabah, particularly the flights I took between the Peninsular Malaysia and East Malaysia. So instead of just merely talking about it, we built a flight simulator in the classroom. So that day, they were not just learning about aviation, but they were learning about possibilities. And possibilities actually change people. In another science lesson, a boy raised his hand and asked, "Teacher, what does the beach look like?" And at that moment, I paused. Because growing up in Penang, the sea was something ordinary, but for him, it was not. So I came back and brought actual seawater, real sand, pictures, stories from the coast, and we built a beach inside the classroom. And at that moment, something felt very distant to them suddenly felt real. And children who had never seen the sea started discussing marine conservation, not because it was part of the syllabus, but because that day they cared. Learning became real, not distant, not abstract, but simply human. So here's what fascinated me the most. When students felt seen, their confidence exploded. The quiet child began leading discussions. The one labeled weak suddenly started asking questions. And the one who often skipped school began to show up. Sometimes it's not that students are failing education, but sometimes it's education that's failing to recognize their potentials. You see, we often measure students with a very narrow definition of success. Grades, rankings, examinations. But let me ask you this. How do you measure resilience? How do you grade courage? How do you score a child who faces hardship each day and still show up to school wanting to learn? Well, some of the strongest students I ever known would have never taught national examinations, but yet they possess leadership, adaptability, grit. These are skills the future desperately needs, and they often go overlooked because they exist outside the blueprint. So one of my most powerful moments in teaching was during a trip to Mumbai. So we got a scholarship to bring 2 students to attend the Kids Education Revolution organized by Teach for India. For Aga and Safika, this was more than just a trip. This was the first time that they ever boarded a plane. The first 2 from their village to ever leave Malaysia. And one evening during the trip, one of them turned to me and said, "Cikgu, dulu ada orang kata orang asli mana boleh pergi jauh. Sekarang saya sudah sampai di India." And then he added, "Saya juga mahu budak-budak dari kampung saya untuk belajar dan jadi macam saya." I was speechless. Because hidden within those words was more than just a journey. It was freedom. It was freedom from the limitations that had been imposed on him for years. And that was when I realized that sometimes education is not about teaching children what the world is, but it's also about convincing them that they have a place in it. Today, both Aga and Safika have completed the SPM, and just a month ago, Safika enrolled at a college pursuing a diploma in early childhood education. When I asked her of a choice, she simply said, "I want to come back and help children from my village to go further than I did." And within those statements, I realized something very profound. That education is not about creating achievement. It is about belief. Because when one child succeeds, it changes a life. But when the child returns to uplift a community, it changes generations. Beyond the blueprint means that recognizing that education is deeply human. It's understanding that students are not just mere machines designed to produce grades. Their stories, their dreams, their possibilities. And sometimes the greatest thing a teacher can do is not to just teach content, but it's to restore belief. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that blueprints don't matter. Blueprints do matter. Curriculum does matter. Structure matters. But what I'm trying to say here is that blueprints exist to guide us, not confine us. Because when education becomes too rigid, we start to only see the system and we do not see the child. And children should never be secondary to systems. Today, somewhere in the world, sitting in a classroom, a child is believing that they're not smart enough. Not because that is true, but it is because no one has yet to discover their potential. And that is a tragedy we must fix. Because talent is universal, opportunity is not. So if there's one thing that I'd like all of you to take away from today, is this: that education should not just merely prepare students to fit into this world. It should prepare them to transform it. And transformation only happens when we dare to look beyond the blueprint, beyond rigid definitions of intelligence, beyond standardized expectations, beyond the belief that learning only can happen through examinations and textbooks. Because when learning becomes meaningful, the child does not only learn, but they awaken. I still do think about the kids in Banu, their laughter, their curiosity, their resilience. And during my bi-weekly classes that I continue to have with them, they often remind me that some of the world's greatest potentials still live in places people often overlook. And we need someone to look beyond the blueprint, to bring those potentials to reality. Thank you.